All right, no questions, really? Really? I'm so surprised by that. Okay, so we're just about to round up part one of the course, right? So hopefully we're on a roll, and a week from now we'll do a basic intro to environmental systems. So roundtables on Thursday. That'll be fun. If you're interested, the roundtable from a year ago was online. Actually, we broke that up into 2 sessions, just the way the class was set up. And you can get a sense of what kinds of questions that you might get asked. The idea here is for the roundtables that you folks are in charge. I'll just sort of moderate a discussion and try to lead it through topics of environmental science as they relate to Assignment 1. And trying to connect it back to these impact metrics. I'll probably start off with 10 slides or so on EDIP and Eco Indicator 99 and start asking questions about some of the environmental principles that you read associated with Assignment 1. So Thursday, you're doing most of the talking. I think, again, the participation level in the class has been fantastic, especially since that first session. So just keep rolling. All right, last chance for questions. Okay, let's go. Okay, so today we're moving out of our discussion on life cycle assessment. You'll remember over the past few sessions we've been talking about the ISO standards for life cycle assessment. Last time we talked about input-output life cycle assessment as well as consequential life cycle assessment. So today we're trying to move to the other side of our mind where we think about money. So we think about environmental assessment as we have. The other side of a sustainability assessment involves money. So today is really a review of what you've seen already in a course like Econ 101 and in topics you might have seen even in high school. So how many people could sort of hammer out some net present value calculations if I asked right now? All right, half. And then how many people of the rest of you are familiar with the term net present value? Okay, so you've all seen it. So today is strictly review, and the only reason we're taking a class period to do this is because it's going to be coming up time and time again on the assignments, beginning with Assignment 2, but more importantly in Assignment 3 and Assignment 4. Okay, so we're rounding out our assessment methods. We're going to be leaning on some basic finance, on some basic economics, and today is going to review that for you. Okay, so the overview, Econ 101, Finance 101. Some of the definitions will be familiar to you: marginal benefit, marginal supply, the idea of economic efficiency, as well as means to improve economic efficiency. In Assignment 2, we're going to be looking at paper mills on a river and actually sort of modifying the behavior of those paper mills to try to meet environmental targets. So that is the idea of achieving economic efficiency from a social perspective through the vehicle of policy. So today we're just going to review those concepts, and we're going to be spending more of our time moving forward actually applying those concepts, particularly in the homework assignments. Okay, so this is our in-class exercise for today, and if I've got a good read on what's going on here, you're going to nail this one. Okay, so pull out your sheet of paper, whatever it is, put your name on it, and think about this question. $200 you could receive on January 1st, right after the term ends. You have a choice. Take that $200 and run. Or you could take, and that, by the way, is a 40-year annuity. So you're going to be taking that $200 the first day of the year for 40 years. This will be from January 1st, 2012 to the same day in 2051, I guess. So you're getting 40 payments of $200 each year Or you could take that $8,000 today or on January 1st if you want to be technical. So which would you prefer is the question. And what's it worth to you? And what does this have to do with sustainable design? So think about that for a few minutes. Talk to each other. No calculators allowed. All right. And we'll talk about it. So it appears to me that at least some people are having way too much fun with this. So at least up front here. So what's it going to be? Who's going to take $8,000 today? Wow, that's everybody's. Anybody taking the $200 a year? Anybody? All right, Pete. Thank you, Pete. He's just helping me out up here. He's actually being paid $20 a class period to be helpful. It's an annuity. You can calculate what it's worth. Pete, can I ask why the $200?
Well, I'm thinking that if I could just put it in the bank, and if I'm just looking at the savings, I might get interest on that, and then over 40 years, I'm going to have
But what could you do with putting the $8,000 in the bank today?
Well, yeah, but then if you're giving it today, but then
you know you're going to spend it, right? You don't trust yourself. You're just going to blow it on recorded DVDs of this class. And, no, that's no way to make money, as we all know. All right, so I'm going to take that as being unanimous then. So what's it worth to you? So, suppose that, this $8,000 today, I'm trying to get you to take the annuity, right? So maybe I owe you $8,000, okay? And apparently you're not taking my $200 a year for 40 years, so what would that have to be? It's more than $200. $300? $400? More than $1,000? Good, Arjun?
That you can
Who decides what that is? No, you decide.
Depends on
This is your money. I owe you money, right? Yeah. Right. So yeah, interest rate's important, and interest and inflation and rent, and we'll talk about those things, right? But if this is a decision between you and I, then it's up to you. This goes back to what we talked about on the first day. So really, that one slide where we talked about the tragedy of the commons, our first slide of the semester, basically we're going to hit all those concepts, today. It's going to take us, 80 minutes to kind of get through all those ideas that we talked about conceptually, connecting it back what you learned about finance, what you learned about Econ 101. Okay. What does this have to do with sustainable design? What do you think of that? Go ahead. I can read your name.
Makeley.
Makeley.
A lot of technologies will have upfront costs but future benefits, and so it depends on what your discount rate is, whether it's worth investing in that upfront cost.
Exactly. So as Makeley says, if I'm doing something different than I'm doing today, I'm probably putting money there. I'm thinking about payback, and I want to know how fast that payback is, and all that means is I've got to now think about what the future is worth to me. Sustainability is about the future. We made that point on the first day of class. All right, it's not about today. It's about, obviously, keeping things running for our kids and their kids. And therefore, how we think about money in the future really matters. So I think some things are going to come to light as we discuss that today. So we can think about the economy, right? We've got firms and we've got households, and generally firms produce and households consume, although firms consume and households produce also. So it's a little bit messier than this. Everything we have comes from the environment: air, water, energy, raw materials. We pollute to the environment. This is the basic structure of the relationship. Environment generally doesn't win in that relationship. We can think about quantity demanded. This would be of production. And what's often counterintuitive, at least to me, is that price ends up on the y-axis, you might remember. So you can think about quantity demanded as being the dependent variable, and usually engineers put the dependent variable on the y-axis. But price, as far as Econ 101 goes, typically goes on the y-axis, so we'll do that. And this would be, your typical demand curve. Everybody's seen this before, right? I'm making that assumption. So we will go very, very fast. High price, you're not going to demand a whole lot of whatever it is that's being produced, right? So the idea is if the price were cheaper, you might buy more. So if an apple's $5, you might buy one. If it was $2.50, maybe you buy two or what have you. Something describes a relationship between what the price is and what the quantity demanded is of that production. And we can think about the demand curve for a market as being the sum of individual demand curves. So, and this is very simple, but if you think of the gold one as sort of being a collective, and this is not drawn to scale, at a given price, the total quantity demanded is the quantity demanded by the first person plus a second person plus a third person, and you just add that up. And as long as they're all linear, this curve will remain linear, and that's all we're going to be talking about in this class, even though when you study demand econometrically, it's anything but linear. But this is a way to think about and structure these kinds of problems. So we'll think of demand this way, right? A collection of individuals. And we can think of the total benefit of an allocation. So allocation is a fancy word for the market figuring out what the quantity demanded is at a given price. So let's just set an allocation that's Q sub D here. This is just the quantity demanded, and this is the price at that quantity, P sub D. And just going through some definitions here, the total willingness to pay is the area under the curve. We can call that the total benefit also. So why do we call it the total willingness to pay? Well, somebody was willing to pay P max here, and a few people were willing to pay a little bit less than that. And you can sort of map that out until you get to Q sub D, right? So the willingness to pay for the first person was actually a lot higher than that person had to pay. So we can think about the willingness to pay actually being higher than the need to pay at a given allocation here. Okay, so just working our way through some definitions here. And this demand curve actually gets called the marginal benefit curve for the reason that that total benefit goes up by an incremental amount as the quantity demanded increases a little bit. So we can think about the marginal increase in the quantity leads to a marginal benefit because the area under the curve grows. Okay, so this then becomes the marginal benefit curve. Okay, just some definitions. So far, so good? All right, I'll just pause to make sure everybody's with us. I think most of you have seen this before. Okay, straightforward. Flip it around. Let's talk about costs and supply. You can think about the marginal supply curve. So at a low price, there is less incentive to provide supply on the part of industry. As the price increases, there is a greater willingness to supply, and you can construct a linear marginal supply curve. The total cost to supply a given quantity is just the area under the cost curve or the marginal supply curve at that allocation. Okay, so that's your total cost. And you can presumably think about this as a net present value. Okay, oftentimes that's not said explicitly, but thinking about the potential for future costs we could think about that as being a net present value. Now, the main rule of economic efficiency, or sort of the way markets function, is that markets are going to work to maximize the total net benefit. Okay, no surprise to anybody. If you think about an example, here's just preserving a river. And we could think about a certain distance on a river. We're going to try to keep it clean. We're going to keep the riparian region there clean. And we can think about the cost to preserve 4 miles and whether that is an economically efficient number of miles to preserve. And the question would be, basically, if the net benefit from the uses of the river and the productive resources we extract from the river in that 4 miles can be increased, or if that benefit can be increased by preserving a longer reach of that river, then that 4 miles is not going to be considered economically efficient, right? Because you can increase the benefit by preserving more miles. Or you can construct an example where maybe 4 miles is too much of the river, right? So the idea, maximize net benefit and achieve the allocation in the market that maximizes net benefit. Okay? Just throwing some jargon at you, getting you calibrated, because we'll be talking and using this jargon throughout. Okay? So far, so good? Okay. Well, then we need a way to compute the total net benefit. We've already defined the total benefit. We can add the marginal cost, so we know what the total benefit is, we know what the total cost is, and I think it will surprise no one that the net benefit is the total benefit here minus the total cost to achieve the net benefit. All right, so far so good? So we're trying to achieve an economically efficient outcome, a market optimal outcome. Is this allocation at the quantity Q sub D and at the price per unit P sub D, is that economically efficient? No? Why not?
Get more benefit.
So if you produce more, you can get more benefit. So here we are at Q sub 1. If we produce more, you get Q sub E. And this might be the only thing you remembered from Econ 101. It certainly was the only thing I remembered from Econ 101 until I took a course like 4 years later. That, where these curves cross tends to be where you're maximizing the net benefit. If you pass this point, right, you keep producing beyond it, now you're going to have losses. The total costs exceed the total benefits on the margin past Q sub E if you go toward the right here. Okay? Anybody surprised by that? You remember those curves crossing, and that's fun. You're going to have homework assignments where you're making the curves cross. Yeah, it's fun. It's fun. We've got some enthusiasm up front. You can think about it too, right? Because if you can come up with an example. For instance, in part 4, we're going to be talking about air pollution. Let's suppose that we put a price on carbon, or we tax some air emission, right? So now the price is going to change. And then the quantities are going to change, and the quantities are going to change, so the pollution is going to change. And we'd like to know how those relationships work, because environmental sustainability is about the nexus between the environment and the economics of the system, right? So it's important for us in a course like this to be able to make those connections, right? As straightforward as they may be. Okay. So far, so good? All right. Don't keep moving, because that's going to lead to loss. Okay. A couple more definitions here. So we've defined the net benefit as being above the cost curve. Let's talk about consumer surplus. Who can define consumer surplus for us? Go ahead.
Remember, it's the part of the net benefit that is above the price and below the
above the price?
Yeah, below the downward sloping curve.
Yeah, so like this triangle down here? what you're talking about? I hope that's what you define. Yep. So basically take out the part of the net benefit below the price, and we call this the consumer surplus. All right, so I'm finally seeing a few perplexed looks, which is good. So the idea of the consumer surplus is that, let me use a Chevy Volt, it's our new plug-in electric car here. Maybe I would have spent $100,000 on that car because I'm geeked about this car, right? But they're only making me pay, what, 42? And then government's going to give me 7.5, so it's like 35. So yeah, it's just like payday, right? I would have paid $100,000, but in the end, I don't have to pay more than $35,000. So that's a surplus, right? So we can define that surplus. You can call him, a sucker, the first person who would have been willing to pay more, or just the enthusiastic might be a better word. And that consumer surplus is the quantity demand and the price comes down. You're going to find fewer and fewer of those individuals. So the surplus decreases as the price decreases. Okay, follows the marginal benefit down. Does that idea make sense? It can't dip below the price because there's no surplus. Does that work? All right, who wants to venture a guess what the producer surplus is?
Triangle missing from the net
Yeah,
benefit.
there you go. Thank you. Yeah, it's exactly so. Missing triangle. So the consumer surplus, but plus the producer surplus is your total net benefit, right? So surplus is the benefit to the consumer surplus, the benefit to the consumer. Producer surplus, the benefit to the producer. The total is the total net benefit. And it's a producer surplus because, at this price, the suppliers may have only felt the need to supply, a small number of quantity, maybe one. But the fact is they're getting much more price, so they're incentivized to produce more. So there's a producer surplus below the equilibrium price there. All right. Does that idea work for people? Questions? Okay, so here, just thinking about the difference between private goods and abundant natural resources. So, this is our river. Okay, let's suppose we've got a lot of length of river, and the cost to perhaps protect it is going to be sort of equal in cost per unit. And I want to use this example because this is about the only place I see people get tripped up on homework assignments, is that we get loose about it and we talk about price. But this y-axis is price, it's dollars per unit, or the units. It's per unit. So the abundant natural resource, this is going to be 1 mile, 2 mile, 3 miles. So the cost per mile to protect the river is what's constant there. It's not as if we can protect the whole river for the same cost as we can protect a mile of it. Okay? So abundant natural resource is going to look flat. And the main idea here is that the price is dollars per unit, not dollars. Okay. Does that work? Okay, so this brings us to the idea of an externality. I imagine that a number of you know what an externality is. Who has a definition for us? Yeah, good. Mark? Yeah, what's your name again?
Makeley.
Makeley. I just added an R there.
That's right. It's a cost that's not part of the private cost, but it's the social cost of something, or social benefit that's not included in private benefit.
So there's a cost to somebody who is not the actor making the decision outside the system, or outside the decision-making unit there. Okay? And are externalities good or bad? Depends. Can you give me an example of a negative externality?
Gas emissions.
So I didn't drive my car to work today. I did yesterday because it was raining. And so I live about 5 miles from work. So if I drove the average U.S. car, it would be something like, let me just say, I don't know, 4.5 pounds of CO2 coming out the tailpipe. And let's just say half of that makes it into the atmosphere. And we talked a little bit about the relationship between CO2 piling up in the atmosphere and temperature. And if we believe there is some relationship there, then there is some potentially negative impact in the future from global warming. And there could be a positive impact from global warming too for somebody somewhere in the future. Right? So that's a good example. We can come up with others. Right? In this case, we talk about 2 firms located on a river. Only because we have the big river problem coming up, we're going to be talking about water for about a week and a half coming up. Because water is important too. It's not all climate change. So in this case, we can think about 2 firms located on a river. Now, you all own a steel mill, and I own a resort. And unfortunately for me, my resort is downstream from your steel mill. And yeah, so, you know, suddenly there is a demand for steel, the economy picks up, and my resort's not as popular. Well, it was never popular, but it got even worse. So, so that is, you know, very simple concept of an externality, and it plays in big, right? Because we could talk about water, we can talk about climate change, we could talk about air pollution, you know, tailpipes, smokestacks. You know, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which in most metro areas are not followed. Talk a little bit about that maybe in the next period. Those are all cases where, you know, the person making the decision does not bear all the consequences of his or her action. Okay. So that's an externality. Everybody got that? So this, you know, gets into the point that was raised about private costs and social costs. And generally the social costs, well, I should say, yes, so generally or always, I mean, the social cost cannot be less than the private cost because the private cost is part of the social cost. Okay, so the social costs will only add to what are the private costs. And the externalities are generally what, in an economically efficient market, it's going to be the externalities that make up the difference between the two. Okay? So it's going to, in terms of our simple marginal benefit, marginal supply curves, and their equilibrium point where those curves cross, what an externality means is not only that the social cost is higher than the private cost, but also that production is going to be larger than it should be. Okay, and if we go back to our curves again, that ought to become clearer. So we've got, you know, private costs here, marginal private costs here. We've got marginal social benefit here. And we've got the equilibrium point, let's just call it 10,000 units, where those 2 curves cross, maximize the net benefit, at least from the private perspective. Then we go ahead and we realize that there's some social costs that play in here, and then you realize that, oh, you know, perhaps, you know, the real equilibrium should be something like 8,000 units when we think about true economic efficiency, where all the costs are considered in the market. Okay, it's making sense, right? You remember all this stuff's coming back? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, and the point there was overproduction, right? Curve, really, when the marginal social costs, because that's going to increase the cost, that can only move the quantity demanded lower, right? If we think about the socially or societally economic efficient outcome, okay? Unfortunately, it doesn't say, you know, we need to produce more to protect the environment. This is the reason. Okay, and we can visualize that. So just coming back to our example now, let's just suppose that the equilibrium price is $100 here. Okay, and when we look at the marginal social cost at that quantity demanded at that allocation, the actual price per unit is $180. So there's basically $80 of social cost per unit that's not accounted for. So as we looked at before, the real equilibrium or the net social benefit is where the marginal social cost meets the marginal societal benefit here, and you're carrying around a loss which can be quantified. Right? It's the area in the triangle. Right. So the point on this is markets, because of externalities. Remember we talked about on the first day, the first slide, the difference between 25 pennies and a quarter. And we went from there to say, well, what's the value of the environment? And that's a hard thing to define. Because that's hard to define and the externalities are everywhere, it means we're constantly carrying these social costs around. So the answer to the question, the original question was, why doesn't the environmental issue just go away? It's sort of baked into how we do business, unless we actively step in to address these social losses wherever they may occur. Right. And obviously it's not just environment, there are other externalities also. Yep. Making sense? So, and you can find the actual optimum price, and you can start to think, well, how would I affect the market to actually achieve the economic efficiency from the societal perspective rather than the private perspective, right? So one of the key points here is that pollution, the optimal level of pollution is never zero. Okay, and that tends to bother people, but it's the case. I mean, as long as we're going to live the way we've known to live. Let's put the dollars per unit of pollution on the y-axis here, and we're going to have pollution decreases moving to the right. This is the quantity of pollution. This time it's going down from left to right. And as you decrease pollution, the cost from pollution is going to go down. And usually there's going to be diminishing returns. So a unit of pollution decrease out here, right, it's going to cost more to reduce that pollution. So if we now say, all right, well, this is the cost from pollution. We have reduced pollution to a certain amount. We want to go from this level here to this level here. The costs are going to, per unit, increase, typically, diminishing returns. So if we're going to add up the total costs, the cost from pollution and then the cost to reduce pollution to arrive at the total social cost, then there's going to be a minimum, somewhere in the middle. And it's not going to be, where pollution's zero. All right. So optimal allocation, even with social costs, generally the pollution levels don't go to zero. Okay, does that work? Okay, so when you think about the way this whole thing's working, the natural thought you have is, well, now how do we make the private cost reflect the social cost? Or how do you internalize the externality? So you can think about regulations, but that assumes that regulatory structures work, right? And they can work. They don't have to work. You can see, taxes, really nice way to bring external costs into the private decision making, right? Until you start thinking about how do you set the tax, and is it fair? Let's tax gas. Great idea. People will drive less until you think about the person who's got the old vehicle that has to drive far to work and actually can't afford it. And how do you deal with those issues? And then things suddenly get complex. There's certainly ways to deal with it, but there's more than meets the eye than just saying let the polluter pay. The polluter should pay, but it's not as easy as that. And we'll see this in assignment 2. This stuff's going to come up. You can think about tradable permits. Who wants to describe what a tradable permit scheme is? Siddharth?
It's like, for example, if you look at CO2 emissions, you have a certain number of credits that you're allowed to have a company in industry.
Who has these credits?
Well, industries can buy these credits from an agency, and there's a certain limited number of credits that are sold, and if they pollute more, then they have to buy more credits, and if they produce less, they can sell their credits to someone else. So as pollution reduces, you could reduce the number of credits. As time goes on, you could reduce the number of credits there are in the market. So
I think that's a very good description. I don't think I could do any better than Siddharth, but I'll change the example to sulfur dioxide, because we don't have a national scheme on CO2. But in the Clean Air Act, we do with sulfur, as I think most of you have read about by now. So if you want to cap pollution at a certain level, so somehow magically you figure out what the amount of maybe CO2 or sulfur dioxide emissions that you're going to allow nationally. And then magically you're going to distribute these permits to folks that, say, burn coal with sulfur in it. Electricity, power plants burning coal with sulfur in it. Now, I'm operating a coal-fired power plant. I'm burning coal that has sulfur in it, producing sulfur dioxide, but I don't have enough permits. So I got two options. I can either install equipment to scrub out the sulfur dioxide, or I can buy permits from somebody who has too many permits. Right? Maybe there's somebody on the other side of the state for whom it turns out it's really cheap for them to reduce their sulfur dioxide emissions. They just go ahead and do that. Now they have extra permits and they can make money doing that. And you can show that that way of internalizing externalities is essentially equivalent to a tax-based scheme, assuming that the government has perfect information in both cases, which is obviously a hard thing, right? So there are ways of doing this that we can imagine. This is just the example of a tax now. Same example, where we had our marginal private costs and we're now considering the marginal social costs. And we see that curve and we want to move our equilibrium point from the quantity of 10,000 units to 8,000 units. And we say, okay, well, essentially now how are we going to do that? Well, we could think about the from the production side of the equation. You could say, okay, well, we're going to tax the producers such that the producers don't actually see the $80, but they actually see the $140, right? In that way, they're going to restrict the production. The delta is going to be about $60 there to make that difference, so let's have a tax of $60. This is a big assumption that you actually can map these costs out and that these costs are linear, and you can just begin to imagine the complexities of actually doing this in practice. But for these simple problems, it would have the effect of moving the equilibrium point back from 10,000 units to 8,000 units simply by adding $60 to the price. Okay? That makes sense? Okay. Not too many perplexed looks here. So let's go back to our first slide of 589 a few weeks ago. And we're going to think about, remember we talked about buying lunch and we did the hamburger and pheasant thing, right? We did this visualization exercise and we're buying lunch and we add up the bill and we divide by the number of people here and suddenly everybody's buying pheasant. Let's take that idea now and talk about cattle ranching with, again, apologies to the vegetarians here. And say, okay, you own a ranch and you've got some livestock out there. And I want you to picture on your plot of land how many head of cattle are out there. I don't know anything about ranching, but put that picture in your head. Right? And then, just take a picture of that, and then let's change the game again and say, well, that land isn't just yours. You've got 10 neighbors that are going to share that land with you. Now, are there going to be more cattle there or fewer or the same? Everybody's saying more, right? But that's not efficient, right? That's overproduction. Because if you knew more about cattle ranching than I do, which you probably do, I mean, you know that you can't just put the cattle, just pack them in there shoulder to shoulder, right? Because they got to eat grass, they need some room. And, if there's too many there, then the pasture is going to get overgrazed and nobody's going to survive, right? None of the cattle are going to survive. So there is a quantity that is the maximum production that land can have. And if you knew more about cattle ranching than I did, that initial freeze frame would have had that optimal amount, at least given your assumption about how much land they each need. Right? And then instead of just dividing that with your neighbors, what happens is, you end up getting more and more cattle on the land. And this was the tragedy of the commons. If you go back and sort of read the history on what that was all about, that's what was going on there. So one way to address externalities such as that is to actually assign property rights. So, okay, you actually do own some fraction of that land, and therefore you can do what's optimal for that fraction of land. Right? So basically, setting legal rights to use that land. So it actually works, right? I mean, because anybody who owns the land privately is going to have that incentive to avoid overuse, right? The only problem is that, how do you set property rights? And certain things just aren't property, right? You can't really fence off the ocean, and you can't really fence off the air. So that's where this example comes in. So let's continue with your in-class exercise. I didn't write in-class exercise on the top, but I want you to think about this problem here.